Awesome. So we're with Angela Duckworth here, and we are currently in different places in the world. Angela is in Philadelphia. I'm in Melbourne right now, but I'm excited to catch up with Angela and largely unpack her journey after releasing Grit, one of New York Times bestsellers and a phenomenal book. But I'll get Angela to introduce what she does, what she's working on right now, and then we'll kind of unpack her story from there.
Thank you, James. I am a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm also the CEO and founder of a nonprofit called Character Lab. We work on grit, but other aspects of character, trying to advance both the science and the practice of character development. I'm also a mom of two daughters who are age 14 and 16, so I spend some time doing that. And finally, I will say, like, I am like the people that I study. I truly love what I do, and I work really hard at it.
Awesome. So Angela and I were just having a really fascinating discussion actually around Angela being a mum and her application of grit to kind of that journey, right? Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about not necessarily the challenges, but how that applies?
I think most parents want their kids to grow up to be a lot of things, right? Happy, healthy, nice, but also successful, right? So I would say that I am no different from any other parent, and on my very long list, I do want them to be successful. I want them to feel what it is like to be really good at what you do, which is really the biggest reward of being successful. Like the
Mm.
feeling of like, yeah, I got this, and people valuing your contribution. And to do that, my research suggests that it will take a little bit of grit. So, parenting for grit is something that I've tried to do myself personally, and of course, it's also something that I study. And what I will say is that it's helpful, actually, I think, to understand the science, to understand the psychology of effort and achievement, and the psychology of frustration, the psychology of practice, but it's not all you need. So I have not found myself to be the best parent, like in all circumstances. Sometimes I'm like, wow, how am I so bad at this? I know so much about it intellectually. And I think the lesson is to assume that for everything in life, there's knowing it in your head, and then there's doing it. And I think there's a big gap between just knowing about something intellectually and being able to execute it. And that means that we should get out there and, for all things that we care about, like, really practice and do stuff and see what works and see what doesn't.
Yeah, awesome. You kind of touched on this idea of wanting your children to be successful, as I guess all parents do. Do your daughters ever feel, I guess, a sense of pressure in terms of what you've done in terms of your accolades and then you understanding this idea of grit and approaching parenting in that way? Do they ever reflect or verbalize feeling a sense of pressure?
Yeah, I've actually tried to get my kids to study less, which sounds weird, but they're both in high school and they're like studying all the time. I'm like, what are you doing? I'm like, it's Friday night. Like relax.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I actually cannot remember the last time I asked to see their report card, or like, I remember to ask them what their grades were.
Mm.
Of course, grit is mostly about doing something that you love, which means it's not always your grades. It could be a sport. It could be, actually, I would say that for most kids, probably what they truly love is outside of the
In
eight
the
in the
classrooms,
morning to
right?
two in
Yeah.
the afternoon classroom. Yeah. So I will say they absolutely feel pressure. Maybe if they're very similar to how, uh, well, when I was growing up, my dad actually did talk a lot about success, but even, I think, more powerful than what he said was like his modeling of his preoccupation with work and with achievement. And when
Mm.
when my daughters come home from school and they see their mom, like, working incredibly hard, working on Saturday, working on Sunday, taking conference calls after dinner, like, I think they've gotten the message that, like, working really hard and doing what you do very well is important. So there's definitely a lot of pressure in our house, for good or for bad.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that, and it sounds, it not only sounds, but you can definitely see how grounded you are, Angela, in terms of internalizing one what you've learned, but also the real life applications of it, right? Because we talked about it before. You can, whether it's like an information bias, and you can just learn a lot and listen to a lot of podcasts and all these things, but at the end of the day, it's like how you apply it to your real life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to toggle back and forth between, I listen to podcasts too, by the way. Like I listen to podcasts, I read books, I like watch documentaries, and I think toggling between those moments where you're like listening to someone's story and it's really powerful and they say something profound, but then you toggle back to like life and then you try it out and then toggle. I think the toggling is really helpful, but don't get stuck in either completely unreflective activity, which is not
Hmm.
as beneficial as like occasionally reflecting. But also, don't just think about things. I mean, when I meet young people and they don't know what to do with their lives, and all they do is think about it, or even think and write about it, I'm like, go do something. You're going to learn 100 times more if you just try one of those things that you've been writing about in your journal.
What's like a practical advice for people to go do something, right? Like, because in a lot of ways, a lot of people, whether it's procrastination, whether it's hesitancy to actually do something because of a fear of failure, a lot of the blockage comes from a sense of like insecurity or potential fear, right? Like, what's some practical advice for people who want to go out and actually do something?
It's a very astute observation. I think fear gets in the way a lot of the time because if you're choosing whether you're gonna like try something new tomorrow, Tuesday, or not try something new
Yeah,
tomorrow, like just you could easily just not, and it's almost a guarantee that you'll feel more comfortable and um, bad things like being embarrassed won't happen. So one thing to do is to just make a rule and like decide. I mean, for example, Brian Grazer, the movie producer,
mm,
he just made a rule that he would have a conversation with one new person in entertainment every single day when he was just starting out. And it was a rule, but so he wouldn't let himself go to bed until he had had that conversation with one new person.
I love it.
And I think a rule like that, where you're like, okay, this is hard for me, so I'm going to make a rule that like every day I'm going to do one thing that's like 5 minutes long, like that's related to me figuring out what I want to do next. Rules are really interesting things because rules that other people impose upon you feel like they're kind of limiting your freedom.
Yeah.
But I think rules that you impose on yourself are the things that give you freedom.
I love that. I love the like how liberating self accountability can be, right? Like, so when it comes from inside, suddenly you have to hold yourself accountable, and you have no one to blame. And it's like, well, I either do this or I don't. I break my rule or I stay to it. I love that. Awesome.
Absolutely. That's exactly the idea.
Love it, love it. Okay, Angela, I want to be conscious of your time. So the last question I'm going to ask you is a question I love asking everybody, and it gives us an insight into, I guess, like what you've learned over your journey, and I guess the journey is always continuing, right? And there's no end goal or end point to that. But if you could run the clock back to what you see as the start of your journey, and it can be totally subjective. It could be at the start of Grit, it could be before you got into academia, it could be before you started the Character Lab. What lessons would you tell yourself, or what pieces of advice would you tell yourself?
Interesting. My guess is that a lot of people answer this question by saying they wouldn't change anything. Do I have that right? That some people are like, I wouldn't change anything at all?
No, funnily enough, people are really raw with it, Angela. Like we've got everything from accept shame or don't feel shame, everything from be super introspective and for not only just figure out your
Mm.
why, but like sit in the pain of your insecurities. It's
That's
uh, it's,
interesting.
it's
Well, it's
anything.
not like yeah, I mean, it's not like I've made no mistakes and so therefore like I wouldn't change anything, but I will say well, I will say this. In my 20s, which
Mm,
so in my 20s I didn't know what I wanted to do.
mm.
And in my 30s I did know what I want to do. And now I'm in my 40s and I'm doing what I want to do. But my 20s were just oh my gosh, so painful. I mean, I cried a river. Like I is so, it's really a painful thing to not know where you're going. And I think that includes not knowing who you're going to be with for the rest of your life, not knowing what you're going to do, not feeling like you may be on track to have a meaningful life. And I was feeling all of those things actually at different parts of my 20s. And maybe I would say that if I could go back and um, and if I could somehow make that journey shorter, um, what would I have done? I think maybe I would have uh, been a little more. I think it can be helpful to be like in some ways like I was trying every day to figure out what I wanted to do,
Mm.
but I think I didn't do anything formal. I never went on a retreat. I never like tried to accelerate that by like I actually didn't read books about like how to figure out what my calling in life was, etc. And I think maybe it would have taken me less than a decade, which is actually how long it took me, if I had been more intentional and more proactive and saying
Yes.
like, yeah, this is not fun. I'm trying to figure it out, rather than just on a daily basis, like trying, like, let me retreat a little bit. Let me read some books on this. Let me get some advice from, a therapist or someone else. I think it would have it would have abridged a little bit of the, existential angst that I felt as a young woman.
No, that's awesome. I really, really like that. Did you find you were getting more introspective or more reflective as you got older? Or is that a quality you think you've had at a younger age?
I feel like, I had a journal actually since I've been
Love
in
it.
third grade, I think. And so I have been very reflective, and I wrote a lot, and I wrote a ton during my 20s. In fact, I think I did more journal writing in my angst ridden 20s than I ever did later. So it wasn't a lack of reflection. I think maybe, maybe actually the kinds of things that you're doing, like maybe if I had listened to other people's reflections and shared some of their wisdom, I think I wasn't getting very far only in my own journal writing. So I'm not saying journal writing isn't helpful, but maybe I could have added to that a little bit of an outside perspective.
Awesome. No, I love that. All right. So if anybody wants to check out more of your thinking other than grit, or wants to check you out on social media, where should they go?
I don't know what I am on social media. I do occasionally tweet. It's actually really me. It's not like a bot or anything else, but I think it's like Angela Duck W or something like that.
Yeah.
And then where my heart and soul is, and where I spend all my time and energy, is characterlab.org. And we're a nonprofit. We try to make new science on grit and other character strengths, and we try to give it away for free.
Beautiful. I'll link that in the bio because I've checked it out myself and it's really, really fantastic what you're doing.
Thank you.
Awesome, guys. That is Angela Duckworth. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.